Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, October 2nd, where we are talking about Edgar Allan Poe. And as you know, Lovecraft thought very highly of Edgar Allan Poe. Now you've had an opportunity to read just a few of his short stories. But even with the 4 short stories that I've assigned, you probably are noticing that there are commonalities between them all, and that there is something about Poe that is unique in terms of his writing style. He tends to be quite poetic, and certainly probably Poe is best known for his poem, The Raven. But even in his prose works, I think you see this attempt to give a sense of poetry to his sentences. So the 4 stories that I had assigned were The Fall of the House of Usher, probably the most challenging of the 4, The Mask of the Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat. So I wanted to make some comments about each of these 4 pieces. And The Fall of the House of Usher is a wonderful example of symbolism. The Usher house is supposed to represent the lineage of the Ushers themselves, the Usher family. It was not unusual for a home to be named after an affluent family, which is what we have here. And the home is falling into disrepair, much like the family lineage has fallen into disrepair. It's never directly stated in the story, but the assumption is that there have been incestual relations going on within the family, and there are no heirs at this particular point. So, the house, that structure, is set in autumn and in the fall. Of course, we've got the idea of fall or collapse, but we also know that the autumn is also quite symbolic for descent. Plus, it's also quite gothic when you want to think about October and Halloween. Alliteration you will find throughout Poe's writing, something as simple as dull, dark day as a descriptor for the moment in which Usher first sees the home, or I should say that Usher's friend first sees the home. And alliteration is the initial repetition of consonant sounds, a little bit different than rhyme, which is where you've got the endings of words that sound similar. Here we've got the beginnings of words. And this house is isolated. The family, the Usher family, is isolated. And with just the little reading that we've done thus far in the Gothic tradition, we know that isolation is always a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. So the narrator arrives alone. That also is a warning bell, on horseback, in order to see the Usher house and Roderick. And we get a first-person narration. This is very typical of Poe. Poe doesn't always do this, but he oftentimes does this. And the subjective eye is always problematic in terms of narration because there's always subjectivity that can be involved with it and bias. The house is personified, which means that there are human qualities given to inanimate objects. The eye, like windows. You might have noticed that eyes are repeated throughout much of Poe's writings, certainly in the few stories that I had assigned for class. The sentience of all vegetable things. The idea that there is a certain, let's say, consciousness that exists in everything. And the drug references are very, very common to Poe. I had asked you to watch a short video of his biography last class. This talks about opium, which of course makes you wonder how valid the descriptions are and the observations are. What we see is a kind of revealing of truth, and Poe's stories, a dropping off of the veil, and how the past comes to invade the present. And certainly we see how the sins of the Usher family over generations have come to a head with the Usher family. And if you want to think about the Usher family also including the house, we've got the brother, we've got the sister, we've got the house, a kind of unholy trinity, if you want to think about it from that perspective. Notice that The idea of the unnatural sensations lead to, again, some foreshadowing and some hinting that other unnatural things have occurred in that house, ancestral relations, for instance. And Poe, being a master of psychology, references the idea of hypochondria. It's one of the things that Lovecraft really appreciated about Edgar Allan Poe, was that Poe was able to understand distressed psychological states. And it allows us to have ambiguity in his writing. We can read his writing as just the ravings of a disturbed individual, or we can also read his writing as a reflection of supernatural events, or perhaps both at the same time. So, this generational family evil in the Usher house is fitting with the Gothic atmosphere that we're given. The Gothic architecture of the house, the decayed trees, the fungi. Poe is a master of creating atmosphere. And we know that Usher is described by having a cadaverousness of complexion. I can't help but think of Frankenstein's creature when I read things like that. Madeline Usher, his twin sister, notice how we have the idea of doubling and doppelganger, something that is very prominent in the world of the Gothic, is diseased but also deceased. So she is filled with illness, but also she will be dead. And the idea of the dead coming to life, we know that this was a fear of Poe, whether it be literal or it be figurative or symbolic, that the past comes back to haunt you. Note that there is a poem that's embedded within the story, and it's called The Haunted Palace, where we're told, such as, but evil things in robes of sorrow assail the monarch's high estate, which is going to be some foreshadowing for the ending of this particular piece. Madeline is put in the family vault, and yes, it would not have been unusual at the time to have a family vault if you were of a certain level of affluence. Her burial, it turns out to be premature. When she supposedly comes back, whether literally or again just in terms of Emily Dickinson kind of haunting, where one need not be a chamber to be haunted. One can be psychologically haunted. And we see the house disintegrate, much like the family is disintegrating as well. And whether this is supernatural or these are the ravings of our narrator or both, we'll never know for certain. When we get to The Mask of Red Death, if you are a Stephen King fan, then you probably are aware of this story because it plays a role in Stephen King's The Shining, which happens to be, by the way, one of my favorite books. Actually, one of the few books that's ever really scared me. There is something about that novel that I find to be quite creepy, especially in relation to the hedge animals. I've tried to figure this out most of my life as to why that is my particular trigger. Haven't figured it out yet, but if I do, you'll be some of the first to know. Now, the Red Death is supposed to be representative of disease and plague, and I can tell you that when I assigned this story after COVID-19 had made its appearance in society, this story had a level of resonance that I had never really appreciated prior. Um, the idea of blood, the Red Death, is supposed to be representational of blood, that blood is the life. And this is a Christian idea. We will see this in texts such as Dracula, which we will be reading as the semester progresses. And we're given a Prince Prospero. And think about Prospero and prosperous. He's happily, dauntless, proud. Notice the P sounds for Prince, Prospero, proud. And assuming that he can outwit death because of his power and his privilege. And of course, this will be a cautionary tale to illustrate that no one can outwit death, regardless of their resources. Um, Going into deep seclusion, again, there are a lot of parallels with what happened with COVID-19 when people went down in lockdown. But his seclusion is one that results in a masquerade ball. And the idea of a masquerade ball in the face of death is absolutely ludicrous, in the sense that individuals would be so immune to the realities of the horrors around them. And of course, they will be punished for that kind of insensitivity and for that kind of hubris. Hiding from reality. And of course, the idea of wearing a mask where you are trying to hide your true self, something Shakespeare uses as well in his own writing. So, the Gothic atmosphere, again, that we've come to expect from Poe with Gothic architecture. And we're told that there are 7 rooms, and the number 7 can have lots of symbolic significance. Certainly, there's the idea of lucky 7, and obviously, these individuals are not going to be lucky. But I think more applicable is the idea of the 7 deadly sins, and I would say that the characters in this story are guilty of all of them. Sloth, just laziness. In other words, not necessarily living up to the challenge and trying to assist others. Lust, and it need not necessarily be a kind of physical lust, though we assume that all kinds of sins are occurring in under Prospero's observation, but just the lust or the desire for everlasting life, something we'll talk about with Dracula. Gluttony, which again can be food, but it can also be having more resources than others. Greed, very similar sort of idea. And perhaps it is greedy to assume that you will survive while others won't because you have provisions that others don't. Wrath, and the anger in which these individuals might experience to find out that they are not immune. Envy and pride. And pride is usually the biggest one in these cautionary tales. If you know anything about Oedipus the King, for instance, a great tragedy that helped to establish the tragic tradition, and it is a Greek drama from 430 BC. The idea of pride or hubris, excessive pride, is what ultimately leads to the greatest downfall. And the pride that Prospero shows, and the envy that obviously all of these partygoers must have about the fact of some people being survivors and some not, and they definitely want to be of the survivor class. Think about also 7 in terms of the 7 stages of life. So if we went from infanthood to childhood to teenage to young adult, retirement, and elderly, this could, of course, be the passage of life and how ultimately we all have to experience death, perhaps the greatest unknown, as Lovecraft had talked about. The rooms are given different colors to differentiate them, and perhaps you can even associate some of the colors with some of the sins. So, for instance, green. So, you might have heard of that jealousy is that green eyed monster, which actually comes from Shakespeare, Shakespeare's Othello. So, in terms of thinking about what happens in that particular story, midnight, which is both the end time and the beginning and the end, is where we have supposedly the figure of death invade this seemingly impenetrable gathering. The ebony clock is continuing to announce the time, and time is presented as a kind of enemy. And notice how often Poe will use personification, as I had discussed earlier with The Fall of the House of Usher, capitalizing things like darkness and decay as if they are entities. And of course, darkness and decay, great alliteration, the repetition of the D sounds, which also is suggestive of death. And the ambiguous ending, whether it truly is the red death that's come to take its prey, or whether it just happens to be something or someone that is not of supernatural element, but still invading this particular gathering, and of course introducing disease and plague. when we move to the Telltale Heart and the Black Cat, you probably notice that they're very similar to one another, oftentimes done on the high school level. Notice we have I narrators again, and it would seem insane I narrators. Perhaps that's one of the biggest fears, is that one could be insane and not know one is insane. And each time we have a narrator who declares their sanity, that's just an additional piece of evidence to show their insanity, especially as we're related, especially as all of these related events are unfolding in front of us that are so grim and macabre. Now, the first word in the Telltale Heart is true. And the question always is with Poe is, what is true? What can we believe? What can we not? Notice we're referenced to eyes again, and eyes can see the truth. There's also reference to eyes with an evil eye, superstitious belief that a dark look or even a dark thought is capable of inflicting injury upon another. And of course, we're told in the Telltale Heart about this vulture eye. Of course, a vulture is a bird of prey. All of this is very negative in terms of the atmosphere, going down to midnight, and again, the personification of death, and rather macabre instances. After all, a corpse is dismembered, though we aren't given the gory details in the gross out that we might necessarily be given in some of the upcoming works. I think of The Exorcist, for instance. And the fact that our narrator can be so calm about the events that are unfolding suggests the true insanity of our narrator. The police sort of representing this moral authority, and that beating heart at the end, which could just be the narrator's beating heart. Beating heart suggests things like life, but also suggests things like fear. So the narrator realizes that he's going to be held accountable for his crimes. And in fact, part of the reason why his crimes are going to be unearthed is because of his hubris. Again, a theme we have seen many times previously. And whether or not we have an ambiguous ending that there is indeed some sort of supernatural beating of the heart, or whether this is a figment of the narrator's imagination, we know that the consequences are going to be moral justice. Just the same with the black cat. And think about all of the associations with cats, especially black cats, and superstitious evil. Though in Egypt they were known as gods and quite sacred, so again, it's cultural in many respects. When we have an I narrator, and the true evil in this story is alcohol, and the narrator maintains his innocence until he began to drink to excess. But one has to question that. Of course, one has to question everything in terms of Poe's narrators, and it's going to be executed in the gallows, rather fittingly considering how he ended up killing one of the cats. But if you're ever going to tell the truth, it's probably your confession before execution. We can never know for certain if we have a narrator who's telling us the truth. This narrator is convinced that the true evil is intemperance, and this is why he lost his ability to reason and is engaged in meaningless violence and self-destruction. Maybe what's even more horrific is that meaningless violence and self-destruction can occur without any kind of external force or without any kind of explanation. Notice the name of the cat, Pluto. Pluto is the Roman god of the underworld and the lord of death. And very deliberate, the choices that Poe is making in his writing. Again, we're told about the eye and how eyes can see truth. And very, I think, astute observation in terms of psychology in the edition of the text that I had ordered on page 110, that we tend to be attracted to the forbidden, that we want to commit vile actions because we're not supposed to. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why we're tempted to read Gothic literature, because it is somewhat forbidden and something you're not supposed to be doing. And this image of the rope cap that's left there, it's almost like it's been burned in hellfire. Of course, we could say that the hellfire is suggestive of what our narrator is going to be experiencing as well. And then we get a second cat. more doppelganger doubling idea. An eyeless cat, of course, because the first cat had his eye removed by our narrator, um, but with a white splotch. And we're told about how ultimately, in the narrator's attempt to kill the cat, he ultimately acts as his wife. It's very interesting how many readers respond to this story, where they will say that this is, out of the 4 that I've assigned, the most disturbing story, and not because of the murder of the wife, it's because of the animal abuse that occurs in the story. Ultimately, the wife is buried in the cellar walls. This is where you can bury secrets, if you will. The police once again appear as moral authority. Once again, we have that sense of perpetrators bragging about their crimes. In fact, as we saw in the video that I had suggested, Edgar Allan Poe is credited with creating the first detective story. So this idea of looking into the minds of not just insanity, but the minds of criminal insanity is something that we oftentimes see in Poe. And once again, we have a premature burial of the cat with an ambiguous ending. Either this is the spirit of the cat that is howling out, or this is a cat that was literally buried alive and is howling out. And the hubris of the narrator is what leads to exposing his evil deeds as he taunts the police. So in these 4 stories, last class I had asked you to identify, before we had talked about any of the 4, which was your favorite and why. Today I thought what I could ask you for your attendance question is to talk a little bit about language, since Poe is a master of language. So our attendance question, and this will be due on the 4th of October. Again, if you need an extension, please feel free to let me know. Again, you're not required to answer your classmates, but I encourage you to do so. But you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. I'd like you to select a quote from one of the 4 stories that I had assigned, either The Fall of the House of Usher, or The Mask of Red Death, or The Telltale Heart, or The Black Cat, and discuss why you think that quote is important. So that next class we can put some closure onto Edgar Allan Poe and move forward with our next piece, which is a novella, which is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You can see in the notes below I was able to find a link for it in the event that you don't have a paper copy of it. And this novella will be certainly longer than Poe's short stories and will deal with more than just one single incident. But it won't be nearly as long as what we saw with Frankenstein. And Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde has become part of popular culture, maybe not to the extent that Frankenstein has, but if you've ever heard the expression about a Jekyll and Hyde personality, the idea of both good and bad being exhibited within the same individual, that comes from the text Jekyll and Hyde, which we'll talk about. So at this point, if you have not finished Poe, it's time to finish Poe. And ideally, you will have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde read in its entirety on our Monday class or shortly thereafter. This is when we move into Dracula, the longest text of the semester, but I think in some ways the most satisfying text of the semester, especially because it'll fall during Halloween time. And I'm also hopeful that you're thinking about papers, because now that you have completed Frankenstein, you are close to completing Edgar Allan Poe, and you might elect to write about Poe. If you are going to write about Poe, I would limit it to 2 stories maximum. I think that once you begin talking about multiple stories, it becomes difficult to be able to have a thesis that's controllable. So, or you can even devote a paper just to 1 story and analyze it in depth. So I look forward to reading the quotes that you've selected, and I'll fill in a few of my own, and then we will continue on next class. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Take care. Bye-bye.